You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
This episode of Rootbound is brought to you by succulents, the desert plants with the sexy name. Succulents, surprisingly juicy.
Hey everybody, Steve here, and welcome to another episode of Rootbound. When I was researching my plant for this episode, this concept came up that I've mentioned in a few other episodes in passing, and it's one of those concepts where I kind of got it, but I didn't really get it, and so I decided to really try to get it before I recorded the intro here, and I think I got closer, maybe not 100%, but anyway, that topic is C4 plants. No, it doesn't have anything to do with explosives. C4 plants are plants that perform a slightly modified version of photosynthesis that is more efficient and better at retaining water than most other plants. You see, most other plants are what are called C3 plants. And so let me explain what C3 photosynthesis is, which will then let me talk about what C4 photosynthesis is. So for C3 photosynthesis, let's talk about a little molecule called rubisco. Do you remember that from high school biology class, rubisco? It sounds like a cereal, but it's not. It actually stands for, I'm reading here from my computer, ribulose 1,5-biphosphate carboxylase oxygenase. And this is the enzyme that is primarily responsible for carbon fixation, so bringing that CO2 out of the air and turning it into carbon material in the plant. It's really important. That's how plants get bigger. That's how plants trap carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They use this molecule called rubisco. And in this process, it's kind of complicated. I saw this really cool video on Khan Academy that explains it. I'll link in the show notes so you can see it better. There's this cycle for how rubisco works. And at the end of that cycle, there is a 3-carbon chain molecule, which has a very long name. I don't recall exactly what it is here, but you can see it later in the show notes. But it's a 3-carbon chain. And that's why it's called C3 photosynthesis. However, rubisco has a little bit of an efficiency problem because what the plant really wants is for CO2 to fuse with rubisco, then this chemical reaction occurs, and it's able to capture that carbon and do other stuff with it. However, rubisco can also bond with oxygen in the atmosphere. And when rubisco bonds with oxygen, basically, the whole cycle happens, but the plant doesn't really get anything out of it. And so the plant has to kind of eject those molecules and kind of start over. And that makes the process of photosynthesis not entirely efficient. So that's where C4 plants come in. C4 plants have evolved this interesting mechanism, which definitely watch the video I'm going to share in the show notes because it's kind of complicated. But the end result is they're able to avoid oxygen binding to rubisco in that process. And that makes the photosynthesis more efficient, and also because they're not having to keep their stomas open so long to bring in more CO2, they are more water efficient as well, because not as much water escapes out through the stoma, the little holes in the leaves. So I thought that was really cool. That's what C4 photosynthesis is, and just to name a few of the rock star C4 plants out there that most people know, a lot of them are weird grasses that people haven't heard of, but there's a few ones that everyone's heard of. One is papyrus, the plant that was used to make the OG paper. Also, sugarcane is a C4 plant, and probably the most famous C4 plant of them all, corn.
I hope you have a corntastic day.
A corntastic day?
What? It's just a pun about corn.
Hi, Jill. Welcome to Rootbound.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Just before we get started, we are recording this remotely. You are in another place. However, I am setting the stage because there is a thunderstorm happening at the moment. And so, audience, if you hear any loud booms, I'm totally okay. It's just thunder in the background. If all of a sudden there's a weird edit, it's because the power cut off and we have to start again at some other time. Hopefully that won't happen, crossing my fingers. But yes, Jill, do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do. So it's actually a genus, and it is the ficus.
Oh, great. Wonderful. I know. I only know recently that well, I won't spoil it for the listeners, but I kind of thought that ficus was like a single kind of plant. It wasn't a genus until very recently. So anyway, let's talk about ficus. I'm very excited.
Great. I hope that's allowed that I did a whole genus.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, great.
We've gone even broader than that before. We did mangroves once, which is an entire category of plants.
Wow,
So,
cool. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I can give the brief overview of ficus. It is a genus
But
of.
first,
Oh, sorry.
but first, why did you choose ficus? Why is ficus meaningful to you?
Sure. Okay, I was going to delve into that next, but I'll do it now.
Okay.
The reason
Yeah,
it's
let's get into that.
meaningful is twofold. One, it was actually my very first houseplant when I was a kid. I've always loved animals forever, as long as I can remember. And when I grew up, our home was filled with a bunch of fake plants because my mom was a terrible green thumb. And I hated them. I thought they were tacky and they were dusty, and I just thought they were ugly. And so I decided, I don't know what age, probably 12 or so, that I wanted to have my own plants. And my first plant was a Ficus Benjamin, which I can go into a little detail on shortly. And I just fell in love with growing plants. I thought it was so neat that you can actually like watch them grow, and they change like almost daily or weekly. And nurturing something and seeing it do well and taking care of it. And I just thought that was really cool. And so that's one reason I love them. And the second reason is where I live now, San Diego. One of my very favorite spots in San Diego is in Balboa Park. There's this huge, huge fig tree. And it is pretty famous in the park, and it's just a really cool landmark. And every time a visitor comes to see me, I have to take them there and show off the tree.
Very good. So now you said something here, which I think you're going to get into, but you said ficus, and for me, I always thought ficus is a house plant, and then like a fig is something different, but apparently that's not the case.
Yeah, so ficus covers all fig trees, but it also covers kind of what you wouldn't call a fig tree, but still fits into the ficus family. Plants that don't produce fig fruit as we know it, but they're still under the ficus umbrella.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So
that tree in Balboa Park, does it have fruit?
that's a really good point. I think it does, but I don't think it's the edible kind that we're used to.
Okay.
That one is called a Moreton Bay fig tree is the actual species, which is a mouthful. I don't know why it's called Moreton Bay. I should have looked. but they're really cool, and they grow huge, and I can get into them a little bit more too.
Yeah, please. All right. Well, let's get into the fun facts and dazzling details. Yes, please.
Great. Okay. So it is a genus of about 850 species, and it's woody trees, shrubs, vines, epiphytes. Have you gone over this word? It's a
Are those the
yeah. Go ahead.
ones that like grow on like other plants or like stuff like that? They're like air plants,
Correct.
I guess, right?
Yeah. So it covers them too.
Nice.
And there's a new word I learned called a hemiepiphyte, which is a plant that starts as an epiphyte and then eventually becomes a more root-bound plant, which is pretty cool.
Doing the name of the show there. Good job.
There you go. That was accidental, but
So
I'm
I
going to
guess,
pretend.
Nice. I think I've seen some of those when I learned that word epiphyte. I think I was in Mexico, and there was this one area where they were like growing everywhere, even on like power lines and stuff. You see these plants, and so I imagine maybe a hemiepiphyte at some point just falls down.
Yeah.
Or maybe its
Or
roots
like
grow or
grows
something
roots.
like that.
Yeah. So there's actually one, I can jump into one. There's actually one species of ficus called the strangler fig. And what it does is it starts its life as an epiphyte, like it attaches itself to maybe a limb on a tree that's alive and growing and not a ficus. And then it starts throwing down roots. It will actually, you can see these amazing pictures where these roots start coming down from this epiphyte into the ground. And then it will also start wrapping its roots around the other tree and basically killing it. So it takes over the tree and strangles it to death, and it plants its own roots in its place. It's really crazy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where do those grow?
I don't know. You're catching me off guard here.
Well, It's all right. It's okay. I always say there's a maxim we say on the show is that the audience can Google it
Yes, that's a good
if
point.
if we don't know. Yes.
Google strangler fig if you're interested. They are pretty crazy
Strangler
and
fig.
really
That's super cool.
But let's go into some more general facts of ficus if you're good with that.
Yeah, please.
So the one that I grew up with, Ficus benjamina, also known as the weeping fig, that one is native to Asia and Australia, and it's the official tree of Bangkok. And when I was doing a little research on it, the really interesting thing I found out, so it's a pretty common houseplant and it's really tolerant and easy to grow, which is why it makes such a good houseplant. But I love that the Wikipedia page says it has been shown to effectively remove gaseous formaldehyde from indoor air.
No, good. That's good. Yeah.
So that's a very nice benefit.
Indeed.
If you've got that problem in your home.
Yeah.
So more generally about ficus, they are known as fig trees or figs also. They are native throughout the tropics with a few species extending into the semi-warm temperate zone. And the common fig is a temperate species native to Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean region. And that is the one that's been cultivated for the fruit. So that's what we're used to when we say we eat figs. It comes from this common fig tree.
I see. What is the species name of that?
I have that. It is Ficus carica. Carica?
Carica.
I don't know what that means, but that's
okay.
That's the guy that we're all familiar with, I think. And then
that's very interesting. I keep telling Carla, my wife, every year that I'm going to plant a fig tree because I really do. I want a fig tree, and I think I should. There's a neighbor that has one that every time I walk by, I should go there soon because they're probably getting ripe. I take a few because it hangs over the fence.
Yep.
But I want one. But but there are a few that are pretty cold hardy and can survive through winter, even though they're I think they've just been selectively bred over time to live further north. There's one that you can get is called the Chicago hardy fig because apparently it can actually grow as far north as Chicago.
That's so cool. I didn't know that one. I love
anyway
figs.
that's my fig fact. That's the one that I know, and I like the fruit, and
I do too.
That's a fig fact.
So this is pretty cool about the fruit specifically. Did you know the whole not symbiotic, I think it's co-evolution with the wasps? Do you know about this?
This rings a bell, but please explain in detail because I think it's really weird from what I remember.
Very weird. So for the longest time, scientists were really confused by fig trees, the ones that produce the fruit, because they didn't see any flowers. And as you know, most of the time, the fruit or vegetable, it's like the flower blooms, it pollinates, it kind of crumples up, and that's what becomes the fruit or the vegetable, if I'm getting that right from what you know. And they never saw any blooms. And they were like, how is it reproducing without a flower? Turns out the flower is inside the fruit. So what happens is it just produces the fruit. And there's this tiny little opening in the bottom. And it doesn't look like a flower inside. It looks like, the beginnings of a fig, but that's technically the flower. And there's this tiny little opening on the bottom of the fig. And the crazy fascinating thing to me is that what I was reading, I can't, I'm not a scientist expert on this, but apparently every single fig species has its own wasp. And this wasp has to find these specific figs that it has this coevolution with, and the female will crawl inside an unripe fig and lay her eggs. And then the newborns hatch and they mate apparently right away. And then the males will chew a tunnel out of the fig and die. And then the females will fly out and find another fig and lay her eggs. So it's this crazy cycle of what I was reading, these fig wasps basically have a lifespan of 48 hours. So it's like they hatch, breed, escape the fig, find a new one, lay eggs, die.
Whoa. Yeah, man, bugs have some weird life cycles. That is really.
And so when the baby hatches in this fig that its mother laid its eggs in, it has the fig's pollen and then it finds its own and pollinates that fig. So it's this crazy, like,
Wow.
yeah.
That's really interesting. That raises a bunch of questions which you may not have the answer to.
Probably not.
That's okay. The audience can Google it. I'm just going to talk about it now. So when you have figs in a place like where they're not native to, does that mean that the fig wasps traveled along with the fig, and so now those fig wasps
Yeah.
like live around here? Like how like my neighbor's fig tree?
Yeah. I
How
have
is it
no
being
idea.
pollinated?
I would guess so, because you think of how many figs are on a tree at any given time when it's ripe. Like if you did move it, there would have to be some eggs in one of the figs.
Yeah.
But I have no idea.
That is super fascinating. I'm going to read some more about that, and yeah, I guess by the time the fruit is ripe, there's little chance of there being
Yeah.
wasps in your
So,
figs.
so they were saying, one of the articles, I was trying to find this because I know people who learn this fact are freaked out that they're eating dead wasps. Apparently what I was reading is it's the male fruit figs that are doing this breeding cycle, but the female fruit figs are the ones we eat. So apparently the ones the wasps are crawling in are not the ones we eat. I don't really understand it, but that's what I was reading.
Yeah, I have to look that more, because you think that at least the one, they would still need to be pollinated, right?
Right. So I don't get it.
Anyway, yeah. Well, I might put some extra in the show notes about that if I find out some more. But that is super fascinating. I just Googled fig wasps and looking at all these pictures of all these different little wasps.
Yeah.
And figs. Very interesting.
Apparently they're super
If that's
tiny
the kind of
too.
stuff creeps you out, audience, don't. Yeah, they do look really small. If that kind of stuff freaks you out, audience, don't Google it, because it's a lot of little tiny wasps covering fruit.
Yeah, and then it does say, I saw one note that was like, don't worry though, not only are the wasps itsy bitsy, but by the time you're cutting up a fig to put in your morning yogurt, the bug has been, at least mostly, broken down by an enzyme called ficane. And this was saying the one, if you happen to get a wasp in one of your fruits, it's probably been broken down. So there's a specific enzyme that breaks down the wasps.
Cool. That's nice. Some extra protein in your fig.
Exactly. Some more interesting facts. There is evidence to suggest that the fig tree was the first plant in Europe to be bred and cultivated for agricultural purposes more than 11,000 years ago.
Oh. Wow. That's really
I thought
fascinating.
that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then there is a specific kind of fig called the banyan tree, or Ficus bengalensis, that can resemble.
That rings a bell.
Yeah?
That name banyan tree rings a bell.
Okay.
What is that?
I need to Google a picture of it. But the thing about them, maybe this is why you know about it. The thing about them is they often resemble an entire forest because of the way they grow. So it's a single plant technically, but they have false trunks and aerial roots. And they do the thing where they kind of drop roots and spread and grow. And the largest one on record is in India, and it spans more than 4 acres. But it's technically a single plant.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, and I think I remember. I think isn't the banyan tree the tree that the Buddha sits under?
Yes.
I think that's like the classic.
Yes.
Yes.
I was actually just about to touch on that. Good timing.
Oh, great. I was like, that rings a bell. So yeah.
Yep. Figs and fig trees have played a prominent role in almost every major religion. And you just touched on Buddhism. The famous Buddha sat at the foot of a Bodhi tree. I think, is that the same as no, it's actually a different tree. Bodhi tree.
Oh, okay. Oh, darn.
Sorry. Which is Ficus religiosa is the name of it.
Wow.
And that's where he is said to have gained spiritual enlightenment.
Very interesting.
And then also religious prominence. The common fig tree is cited in the Bible, Genesis 3:7, where Adam and Eve cover their nakedness with fig leaves.
Right, classic.
Yep. And in Hinduism, I don't know how to say it, sadhus, monks who are abstinent from worldly pleasures. They meditate under fig trees as they believe they hold spiritual significance. And when they chant, I'm not going to try to pretend I can say the chant. It translates to salutation to the king of trees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So that's kind of the basics overview. I did have a little bit more to elaborate on when it comes to that, my favorite spot in Balboa Park. I'd love to give
Yeah,
a little
please.
history there.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Great. So that plant, like I said before, is it's one tree of the species that is the Moreton Bay fig tree. And these trees generally tend to be really large. And if you Google that kind of tree, you'll see tons of examples of really big ones throughout the country. This guy was planted as a small tree in the garden of Balboa Park in 1915. So it's quite old, over 100.
Wow.
And it was planted, I thought this was kind of cool. It was planted because of the Panama, California Exposition, which was an event that was held between January 1st, 1915 and January 1st, 1917. And it was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, which is kind of
Whoa,
neat.
that's great. Yeah.
And they were trying to push San Diego because they wanted it to be the first port of call for ships traveling north from Panama. So they were trying to kind of, get attention and say, hey, you should stop here.
More like marketing these days should be done by planting a tree.
Right. Right. And the thing is still going. And
I'm looking at a picture of it now.
It's so cool.
Really awesome. Wow.
It was last officially measured in 1996. And at that time, it was measured at 78 feet high with a crown that is 123 feet and a trunk girth of 40 and a half feet.
Wow.
So this thing is unbelievable.
Amazing.
Yeah. And it was, I guess they said that back in the day, people used to be able to climb into it and climb the tree itself and climb all over the roots. And of course, as people do, it started to kind of damage the tree. So they did fence it off, so you can no longer go up to it. But they did build this really cool seating viewing platform, which is right in front of the tree. And it has these benches and it's just really peaceful. And you can just sit there and read a book and it's beautiful. So that's, like I said, one of my favorite spots.
The host tree's fate is now sealed, for it is in the clutches of a strangler fig.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing about the entire genus of Ficus. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
I would love to hear it.
All right, so this one, I kind of like this. What I like about this podcast is you can start with something kind of basic, and I ended up going on quite a journey here, and I kind of going to go a little off topic, but it has this thread, and it starts with just a simple weed that grows in lawns. You've probably seen it. It's everywhere. You might not know what it is because we tend to ignore those. But basically, I was mowing the lawn the other day, and I was like, I should know what all these different kinds of grass are in my lawn and the weeds. And so I used this little app I use called Seek, which I think you've seen before. It's like
yes.
You can it's a great app. And I pointed at this one that had like this tufts of grass, but then it had these longer ones that had these little seed heads coming out. And it was called a Dallisgrass, which is Dallis grass. And you've probably seen it. It grows in these clumps. So it kind of looks like just normal kind of thick grass blades, but it kind of looks like there's a clump of it together. And like if you have a lot of it, they're never going to be like homogeneous. They're going to be in these separate clumps. And they kind of rise up a little bit, and like they have this really thick underground rhizome network. So like they can be pretty tough, I guess, to pull out. They're from native to Argentina and Uruguay and kind of in like the grasslands area of South America, but they're kind of widely spread throughout the world. Pretty commonly regarded to be invasive. But, that's where it's kind of interesting of like, I was thinking about what is the definition of invasive, and like this is a plant that is from this hemisphere and has a lot of, I guess, natural travel north. It's a grass, right? But when I was trying to read about like, well, what's so bad about it? The main thing people say is that it makes your lawn look ugly, which is like it's one of those weeds that people who like perfect lawns hate. But the grass species in those perfect lawns are not native here either.
Exactly.
They're like so. You know, and then the other thing people say is that it makes sports fields like uneven and like you can trip over it because the way they build a clump. But anyway, that's why people don't like it. From what it was either accidental or on purpose. But the reason why it's I think well known in the United States and elsewhere is that it is a very highly regarded forage plant for pasture animals.
Oh.
And its name Dallisgrass comes from some guy named A.T. Dallas who was like a big fan of it for like pasturing animals in Louisiana. And he either brought it in specifically or started cultivating it because it grows really fast. It has a lot of like what animals need. And it's very drought resistant. And it's also a C4 plant, which this is something I'm going to have to do something. Maybe I'm going to do at the beginning of the show. Audience, you may have already heard me explain C4 plants because maybe I'll do that at the beginning of the show. I've mentioned this before on the corn episode. A C4 plant is a specific, it's a kind of plant. Only 5% of plants are C4 plants, and they have a slightly different style of photosynthesis that's actually more efficient.
Oh, wow.
And so they can actually fix carbon faster. They are better in drier areas. And so that's why people love it for like growing in pastures for animals because it's much more resilient, which is really interesting.
That's cool.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. So now we're going to get in the rabbit hole. I was Googling. I like looking up the other names of plants and what they're called. And also like talking about the scientific name. By the way, the scientific name of this is Paspalum dilatatum.
Oh, that's a great
name. It's not super interesting. It sounds interesting, but Paspalum means like grass or something, and dilatatum means like long. It's not super interesting. But when I was looking at other names, I found the names in Spanish because I was like, well, what's the deal with this? That's the thing. It's like if you Google Dallisgrass, you just find about it. Google's just like invasive weed. You can't find any other information about invasive weed, but it does say it's from Argentina and Uruguay and those areas down there. And so it's like, well, let me see what it's called in Spanish. Maybe I can learn a little bit more about this plant because of that. And I was looking at all the common names, and this one name that popped out, which was pasto miel. Do you know what miel means in Spanish?
I don't.
It means honey. Pasto means grass, and miel means honey. And I was like, I'm a beekeeper, as you know. And that stood out to me. And I was like, why is this called pasto miel? Like, I've seen it in my yard. It doesn't have flowers that bees visit. It's like this little, like, it's almost like a wheat grain. It has, like, some people call, another name is caterpillar grass because the seed head is kind of like this long, it looks like a little caterpillar kind of sticking out horizontally with the black seeds kind of dangle on it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have any, like, nectar that I can tell. It's more in this like wheat family. And I was trying to Google that and I couldn't find it. So I had to like get Carla's help, who's a native Spanish speaker, to try to do some Googling in Spanish. And there's like this really interesting, I think, epistemological thing about the internet of like, if you can only search in one language, you really do limit what you can learn.
Yes.
And so I did finally come to this like document that was called the Plants of the Natural Grasslands of the Southern Cone of South America from the Alianza de Pastizal. And that's the Alliance of Grasslands. And I found this, I was reading about it. I Googled in there. I found this whole page about pasto miel. And I'm going to say this in Spanish. I'm going to do my best. Spanish speakers out there, don't get, well, it's going to be bad. But anyway, this is because I understood this and I'm going to say it in Spanish and then I'll translate. I was just reading and then it said, se llama pasto miel por la secreción en sus semillas al ser atacadas por el hongo Claviceps paspali. And that in English means it is called honeygrass because of the secretion of its seeds after the attack from the mushroom Claviceps paspali.
Whoa.
I was like, oh, that's super interesting. What is Claviceps paspali?
Yeah.
So I searched for Claviceps paspali, and it turns out that, well, one thing about the grass is that this mushroom can affect animals that graze it. So that's one negative side of it. If the animals eat an infected grass, it can give them what is called stutters, where they can like fall over and like convulse. And that's because claviceps is the genus of the fungus that is more commonly known as ergot.
Okay.
You're familiar with
No,
ergot?
I'm not.
Ergot is really fascinating, and this is ergot is more known. There's famous incidents of a disease called ergotism in like the Middle Ages, when entire villages would be poisoned
Oh my
from
gosh.
eating bad bread made from rye that is infected by this fungus.
Wow.
And there's two kinds of ergotism. One is called gangrenous ergotism, where it can basically kind of like make your like you get gangrene in extremities and stuff.
That's horrible.
And there's one that's called convulsive ergotism, which like makes you like freak out and like shake and like behave really strangely. And in fact, some people theorize that ergotism explains the strange behaviors around the Salem witch trials.
Oh,
and that it was actually an
wow.
outbreak of convulsive ergotism that was making these women behave strangely and freak out and convulse. And there's been some other. There was apparently a similar incident in Norway.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was like, because, and I knew a little bit about ergot and ergotism, but I never heard about it in like, a South American context. I've only heard about it in this European context. So I was really fascinated about this. A little bit more about.
So can I ask a question then? So the article is
Yeah, please.
saying that when this kind of fungus attacks this grass, what was the honey part? It produces a substance?
It secretes this substance, this sweet substance, and that's what's super fascinating. The life cycle of the claviceps fungus, at one point early in its life cycle, it secretes this stuff that is called honeydew, and it's a sweet, sticky liquid that insects go to collect, and then they spread the fungus from plant to plant because this honeydew is filled with spores, and so.
That's like a horror movie.
Totally. And that's how it spreads all over, and including on Dallisgrass in its native range, and also everywhere Dallisgrass grows. It's like this. A couple more really interesting things about ergotism before we get back to Dallisgrass and we wrap up. The reason why like eating ergot infected grains is bad is because ergot or claviceps fungus, also known as ergot fungus, creates a ton of different alkaloid chemicals, and many of those are just toxic. But some of them are also beneficial and have been used in various medicines. I'll put a link. I forget all the different things that they can treat, but they've been able to isolate certain alkaloids from this mushroom, and it's not the mushroom like you think of. It's a fungus that invades a grain, but they've been turned into commercial drugs. I think one of the most well known, or the first one I ever heard about, this is going back years ago, was I heard about this, that alkaloids from ergot have been used for a long time as treatments for postpartum bleeding, and have actually been developed into commercial drugs now for that.
Whoa.
But the reason I know that is because a scientist who was doing experiments on these different alkaloids from ergot, trying to look for better and better drugs to treat postpartum bleeding, that scientist's name was Albert Hofmann, and in the process, he accidentally discovered LSD.
No way.
LSD is also, or at least it's an enhanced version of an ergot alkaloid. And so some of like the hallucinogens or the crazy ways people behave when they're infected with ergotism is related to that. But LSD is just it is a like tweaked version of a natural compound that apparently is just even more extreme on the hallucinogenic side, but doesn't have as many of like the toxic properties.
Well, yeah,
but anyway,
and that's not even...
He discovered that while...
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, he discovered that while trying to find a drug to treat postpartum bleeding by studying alkaloids coming from ergotism.
That's crazy. Yeah, and I was going to say, that's not even the only like hallucinogenic mushroom. Clearly, there's more than one.
Yeah, that's...
So they just took one and like enhanced it.
Yeah. Basically, it's like the molecules just tweaked slightly. He was trying all these different variations to synthesize different variations of very similar molecules, and one of them, really
Wow.
that story is. I don't need to go into that story. It's a very fascinating story of when he was riding his bike home and kept falling off his bike and didn't know what the hell was
Oh
going
no.
on. He accidentally had the first acid trip and didn't know about it. But that's probably I've gone down a pretty deep rabbit hole about that. I could talk more about that story, which is interesting because he's a Swiss scientist and he actually went to the same university Carlo went to in Switzerland. So anyway, that's that. But getting back to Dallisgrass,
Yes.
I found this. This is where trying to figure out more details about how this grass works and it's possible that it is actually called. A couple sources said it's called honeygrass because it excretes this honey when it's infected, but it's possible it's also called honeygrass because native bees in the area can make honey from it.
Oh.
And I've only found one reference to this, and it's in one book, and maybe there's one other source, but this is one of those things where I think I've exhausted the English language sources of this. But I'm just going to read this because I thought it was really interesting. It's from the Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants, Ethnopharmacology, and its Applications. And it says, in Paraguay, these grasses are apparently often infested with Claviceps paspali. As a result, a sweet secretion, honeydew, forms on the spikes and is consumed by wasps and bees. Bees that have visited these grasses inoculate their honey with this secretion. In the language of the Maca Indians, the resulting honey is called fique, and is recognizable by its pungent aroma. Consumption of large amounts is dangerous, for it can produce dizziness, headaches, and drunkenness. It is said that it can be lethal. The honey is used to brew beer or mead.
Oh my gosh.
Certainly a beverage with potent effects. And then it goes on to say there's a grass called Eleanorus muticus that is used to make an antidote for poisoning from drinks made from honey. Now, whether that was always accidental or whether that this group of people have a practice of making mead specifically out of honey infected by this for its various properties is unclear, and I would really like to learn more about that, but I really couldn't dig any more. But I thought that was super fascinating, and all from just this little weed that grows in my yard.
And it sounds like it doesn't hurt the bee in the process, hopefully.
No, I don't think the bees care. Like the bees collect, the honey, and they're fine, I guess. I don't know. Maybe there's some psychedelic bees out there.
Yeah.
The black outgrowths on this head of rye are the sclerotia of ergot, Claviceps purpurea. The sclerotia, from the Greek skleros, hard, occur on many grain crops and grasses. They contain a group of alkaloids, of which ergotamine, specific in the treatment of migraine, and ergometrine, of great value in obstetrics, are now the most widely used. At least as early as the 16th century, midwives in Europe used ergot to speed labor and control postpartum hemorrhage. But there are two sides to the ergot story. On the one hand, there is its value in therapeutics. On the other, its poisonous nature. For centuries, the European peasant has used rye in his bread, and rye is particularly susceptible to the fungus. Frugal in habit, ignorant of the dangers, the impoverished peasant often neglected to remove the ergot from the rye. So the fungus, milled with the flour, found its way into the bread. In popular tradition, records abound of the sufferings of people, especially the poor, of fiery burning pains along the limbs, mutilations from gangrene, delirium, convulsions, hallucinations, and in many cases, death.
That clip was from a documentary called Ergot, The Story of a Parasitic Fungus from 1958. Very interesting. There will be a link in the show notes. After speaking with Jill, I was reading up a little bit more about figs, and when I was Googling, this quote from The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath kept coming up over and over again, and I thought it was a really interesting and poignant quote. And so, to end the show, I thought I would leave you with that quote from The Bell Jar.
I saw my life branching out before me, like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was E.G., the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions. And another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest. And as I sat there unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one they plopped to the ground at my feet.
My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Jill Harris. Jill is an environmentalist, beer fan, and she knows more about animals than anyone I've ever met. Rootbound is hosted by the person whose voice you are listening to at this very moment, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. But if you can go outside, enjoy some figs, as long as they are currently wasp-free.
Succulents, surprisingly juicy.